Excerpt from Harvest Gypsies, Article 1 by John Steinbeck, 1936. John Steinbeck was an American author who won the 1962 Nobel Prize in Literature. While Steinbeck was most popular for his novels, which were often focused on agricultural workers in California, he also wrote a series of articles on migrant farm workers for the San Francisco News. In this excerpt, Steinbeck discusses the role of migrant workers in California agricultural industry. As you read, take notes on common life and work experiences of migrant farm workers. At this season of the year, when California's great crops come into harvest, the heavy grapes, the prunes, the apples, and the lettuce, and the rapidly maturing cotton, our highways swarm with migrant workers, that shifting group of nomadic, poverty-stricken harvesters, driven by hunger and the threat of hunger from crop to crop. From the harvest to the harvest, up and down the state into Oregon and some to extent into Washington a little. But it is California which has the need for the majority of these new gypsies. It is a short study of these wanderers that these articles will undertake. There are at least 150,000 homeless migrants wandering up and down the state. And that is an army large enough to make it important to every person in the state. To the casual trapper on the great highways, the movements of the migrants are mysterious, if they are seen at all. For suddenly the roads will be filled with open rattletrap cars loaded with children and with dirty bedding, with fire-blackened cooking utensils. The box cars and the gondolas on the railroad lines will be filled with men, and then, just as suddenly, they will have disappeared from the main routes. On the side roads near the rivers, where there is little travels, the squalid, filthy squatters' camp will have been set up, and the orchards will be filled with picklers and cutters and dryers. The unique nature of California's agriculture requires that these migrants exist, and requires that they move about. Peaches and grapes, hops and cotton cannot be harvested by a resident population of laborers. For example, a large peach orchard, which requires the work of 20 men the year round, will need about as many as 2,000 for the brief time of picking and packing. And if the migration of 2,000 should not occur, it should be delayed even a week, the crop will rot and be lost. Thus, in California, we find a curious attitude towards the group that make our agricultural successful. The migrants are needed, and they are hated. Arriving in the district, they find the dislike of always melted out by the resident to the foreigner, the outlander. This hatred of stranger occurs in the whole range of human history, from the most primitive village from our own highly organized industrial farming. These migrants are hated for the following reasons: that they are ignorant and dirty people, and that they are carriers of disease, and that they increase the necessity for police and the tax bill for schooling in the community, and that if they're allowed to organize, they can, simply by refusing work, wipe out the season's crops. They are never received into community nor into the life of the community. Wanderers, in fact, they are never allowed to feel at home in the communities that demand their services. Let's see what kind of people they are, where they come from, and the routes of their wanderings. In the past, there have been several races encouraged to come, often imported as cheap labor. Chinese in the earlier period, then Filipinos, Japanese, and Mexicans. These were foreigners, and as such, they were ostracized and segregated and herded about. If they attempted to organize, they were deported or arrested, having no advocates. They were never able to get a hearing for their problems. But in recent years, the foreign migrants have begun to organize, and at this danger signal they have been deported in great numbers, for there was a new reservoir from which great quantity of cheap labor could be obtained. The drought in the Middle West has driven the agricultural populations of Oklahoma, Nebraska, and parts of Kansas and Texas westward. Their lands are destroyed and they can never go back to them. Thousands of them are crossing borders in ancient rattling automobiles, desolate and hungry, and homeless, ready to accept any pay that they may to eat and feed their children. And this is the new thing in migrant labor. For foreign workers are usually imported without their children and everything that remains of their old life with them. They arrive in California, usually having used up every resource to get here, even selling the poor blankets, utensils, and tools on the way to buy gasoline. They arrive bewildered and beaten, and usually in a state of semi-starvation, with only one necessity to face immediately, and that is to find work at any wage in order that the family may eat. And there is only one field in California that can receive them. And eligible for relief, they must become migratory field workers. Because of this kind of laborers, Mexicans, Filipinos are being deported and repatriated very rapidly, while on the other hand, on the river of the Dust Bowl refugees increase all the time, and this new kind of migrant we shall largely consider. Earlier foreign migrants may have really been drawn to from a peon class. This is not the case with the new migrants. They are small farmers who have lost their farm, or smart farmhands who have lived with a family in the old American way. They are men who have been working hard on their own farms and have felt the pride of possessing and living close in touch with the land. They are resourceful and intelligent Americans who have gone through the hell of a drought and have seen their lands wither and die, and the topsoil blow away. And this, to a man who has owned his own land, is a curious, terrible pain. And they have made the crossing and have seen often the death of their children on their way. Their cars have been broken down and have been repaired with ingenuity of the landman. Often they patched out the worn tires every few miles. They have weathered the thing, and they can weather much more, for their blood is strong. They are descendants of men who crossed into the Middle West, who won their lands by fighting, who cultivated the prairies and stayed with them until they went back to the desert. And because of their tradition and their training, and they are not migrants by nature, they are gypsies by force of circumstance. In their heads, as they move wearily from harvest to harvest, there is one urge, one overwhelming need to acquire a little land again and settle on it on top of their wandering. One only has to go into the squatter camps where the families live on the ground and have no homes, no beds, no equipment, and one has only to look at the strong, purposeful faces, often filled with pain, and more often when they see the cooperation idle lands filled with anger, to know that this is a new race is here to stay, and that heed must be taken of it. It should be understood that with this new race, the old methods of repression, of starvation wages, of jailing, beating, and intimidation are not going to work. These are American people. Consequently, we must meet them with understanding and attempt to work out the problem to their benefit as well as ours. It is difficult to believe what one large speculative farmer has said, that the success of California agriculture requires that we create and maintain a peon class. For this is true, then California must depart from the semblance of a democratic government that remains here. The names of the new migrants indicate that they are of English, German, Scandinavian descent. They are Munns, Holbrooks, Sansons, Schmidts. They are strangely agnostic in one way, and have been brought up in the prairies where industration had never penetrated. They have jumped with no transition from the old agrarian self-contained farm, where nearly everything was used, was raised, or manufactured, to a system of agriculture so industrialized that a man who plants the crops does not often see, let alone harvest, the fruits of his planting, where the migrant has no contact with the growth cycle. And there's another difference between their old life and new. They have come from a little farm districts where democracy was not only possible but inevitable, where popular government, where practiced in Grange, in church organization or local government, was responsible of every man. And they have come into a country where, because of the movement necessarily to make a living, they are now allowed to vote whatever, but they are rather considered property of the unprivileged class. Let us see the fields that require the impact of their labor in the districts in which they must travel. As one little boy in a squatter's camp said, We need us, they call us migrants, and when we pick up their crop, we're bums and we get out. There are vegetable crops in the Imperial Valley: the lettuce, cauliflower, tomatoes, cabbage to be picked, packed, and to be hoed and irrigated. There are several crops a year to be harvested, but there is not time distribution sufficient to give the migrants permanent work. Orchards deliver 2 crops a year, but the picking season is short. Farther north in Kern County and up the San Joaquin Valley, the migrants are needed for grapes, cotton, pears, melons, beans, and peaches. In the Aller Valley near Salinas, Watsonville, and Santa Clara, there are lettuce, cauliflower, artichoke, apple, prunes, apricots. North of San Francisco, the produce of grapes, deciduous fruits, and hops. The Sacramento Valley needs masses of migrants for its asparagus, its walnuts, its peaches, its prune, etc. These great valleys with their intensive farming make seasonal demands on migrant labor. A short time then, before the actual picking begins, there's a scurry on the highways, family in open cars hurrying to ready the crops and hurrying to be first at work. For it has been a habit of the Growers Association of the state to provide by importation twice as much labor as was necessary so that the wages might remain low. Hence the hurry, for the migrants is a little late, the places may all be filled, and he would have taken his trip for nothing. And there are many things that may have happened even in his time. The crop may be late, or there may be occur one of those situations that in Nimpopo last year, when 1,200 workers arrived to pick the pea crop only to find it spoiled by rain. All resources have been used to get to the field. The migrants could not move on. They stayed and starved until government aid tardily was found for them. And so they moved frantically with starvation close behind them. In the series of articles, we shall try to see how they live, what kind of people they are, what kind of living standard is, and what is done for them, to them, and what their problems and needs are. While for California has been successful in its use of migrant labor, it's gradually building human structure which will certainly change the state and may, if handled in the inhumanity and stupidity that have characterized the past, and destroy the present system of agricultural economics.